Hey friends, it's RSKT, and in today's video, I want to try something a little bit different. There's a piece of software that I've been eyeing off purchasing for like the last 3+ years, and yeah, I've always wanted to get my hands on it. And you know what? I finally decided to dive in and buy the complete package just to see what it is all about. And that program is called Moho Studio Pro. Moho Studio is a 2D animation package that is in direct competition with other applications like Adobe Animate and Toon Boom Harmony, which for those that don't know is kind of the industry standard for a lot of animation. Now there are like loads of different animation apps out there. They're all really fantastic. There's some really cool open source ones too, and even Blender's 2D animation side of things is like skyrocketing and it's awesome. But I've always wanted to try my hands at Moho. It has a lot of really cool and unique features that I've wanted to play with for some time. Now, the main one being that it gives you the ability to rig 2D characters in a similar way that you would rig 3D characters. Now, you can do this in Blender, but I tried it, and although I got it working, I find it a little bit more convoluted. Just sort of setting things up to work, not exactly using things that work to help you set things up, if that makes sense. And you know, then you've got Toon Boom Harmony, which I've never used. I've always wanted to, but man, that thing costs a lot of money, and I don't have that. So Moho Studio it is. Now, I do have a fair amount of experience when it comes to animation for motion graphics and 3D, but I've never really done a great deal of character animation that isn't frame by frame. And that's sort of where Moho shines, really. The fact that you can rig a 2D character, and then you have a rig to work with that you can constantly reuse and not have to redraw. It's really, really cool, and I can't wait to dive in. So in today's video, I'm basically going to be designing a character using Affinity Designer, and then we'll be bringing that all into Moho so that I can wrap my head around it. So this isn't so much a tutorial as it is watching me fumble my way through trying to learn a piece of software for the first time, but I thought that might be kind of fun for my viewers because a lot of people reach out to me thinking that I'm like super experienced when it comes to using Affinity Designer. And although I have a little bit, probably don't have as much as some other people. And yeah, you know, I wanted to show everybody that you've all got to start somewhere. So, you know, I still used Affinity Designer to design this character because I didn't know how to use the drawing tools in Moho, and I just wanted to stick to the whole rigging animation side of things. But I just thought that it would be kind of fun to sort of see me meander my way through it and make lots of mistakes and hopefully inspire you guys to try something like this yourself. Because at the end of the day, what I wound up making is this. And I wanted to show to people that you can easily pick up pieces of software and just sort of fumble your way through it. Rather than just following tutorial after tutorial, sometimes it's a really good idea to just dive headfirst into something and do your best to make your goals come to life. No matter how arduous and difficult that might be, I often find that that's the best way to learn. You know, I want to do A, B, and C. You get as far as B, realize you don't know how to get to C, so you do a bunch of Googling until you get the result that you're after. And, you know, it just adds a little feather to your cap. So yeah, without any further ado, let's dive in and I'll show you how I went about making this walk cycle in Moho. So the first thing that I did was open up Affinity Designer to start fleshing out a character. I didn't have a pencil sketch or anything to work from, and I thought it might be kind of fun to sort of make a very crude kind of illustration based on myself. I strictly stuck to just grey and white colors when doing this. I don't know why, but sometimes I find it really easy to sort of block out characters like this in a really sort of simple and clean way where I'm not too worried about the colors and just sort of worried about the shapes and the way that each shape sort of represents different parts. So yeah, I kept it pretty basic and mainly just used really rough shapes to try and get as many of my recognizable features as I could. The most obvious being that I have a relatively large nose and I wear glasses. I really wanted to have the ability to turn the head at different angles, so it made sense to make the nose its own shape, and eventually I just changed it to a slightly darker color to make it stand out even more. I tried to keep everything here as simple as possible. As I said before, I haven't really tried Moho out at this point, but I really didn't want to waste a lot of time trying things out with other people's creations. I just wanted to make something really simple and see what I could get away with. I didn't want this character to be too complex. Obviously, I wanted it to be a character, but I didn't want to put in a great amount of detail just because I knew that I hadn't really started to learn Moho just yet. I didn't want to bite off more than I could chew. Now, that being said, I probably did bite off a bit more than I could chew by using my own character. I could have gone online and tracked down somebody else's rig or used one of the rigs included in Moho to wrap my head around this stuff, but I really wanted to see how it would suit sort of my process of illustration. I was hoping to include like a lot of texture work, sort of like what I do with a lot of my other illustrations, but I think I'm going to have to leave that for a later date because this already wound up being more complex than I anticipated. Now, I'm being really careful to name all of the layers appropriately so that when I export everything, they're easily identifiable before I bring them into Moho. Now, you might already be wondering why I'm actually creating this character in Affinity Designer. And that's just because as I said, like I haven't used Moho yet. I know that Moho has a lot of illustration tools in it, but I really just wanted to dive in and learn the rigging and animation side of things first rather than learning how to draw in a whole new application. Now, in the project I'm currently working on, which you can't see yet, but there will be a video on that, I did wrap my head around a lot of the tools in Moho, and man, there are some really cool things that it brings to the table, but there are also a lot of things about it that I don't like. So definitely a fine balancing act. I do think if you're looking to create characters and animate them in Moho, I think it's actually easier to take that route to draw them in Moho and then eventually rig them in the same application. It gives you a lot more freedom and a lot more creative control, and it also helps you avoid a lot of mistakes along the way. Doing it in Affinity Designer sort of gave me the luxury of being able to create something in software I was familiar with, but there wound up being a lot of downsides to that too, which I'll get into shortly. Now, a lot of what you're seeing here winds up getting reworked later on. I sort of found that as I went through the rigging process, certain shapes needed to be completely rethought or redesigned. For example, here I made the hand all one shape. Big mistake, should have left the fingers separate. And there's a couple of other things. The arms, the forearms and the top of the arms, I made the one shape. Did the same thing with the legs. And yeah, it just doesn't work. It might work if I guess you sort of played around with a lot of settings, but ultimately you want sort of as many pixel points as you can get in order to sort of get finer control over the rigging process and animation. Cool, so I was pretty happy at this point with the way that this character was turning out, and now it was just time to play around with the colors. Now, I didn't use any outlines for this character. I wanted it to be fairly flat sort of shapes, but in doing that, I ran into a few issues, which I kind of thought I would. For example, the arms and legs are the same color, so when the left arm passes in front of the body, and it's the same colored shirt, you don't really see it. And at first I tried to sort of work with that and see if I could get away with it, but towards the end I wound up redesigning the arms and legs and making them all separate colors so that they're a little bit easier to spot in front of everything. It didn't actually look as out of place as I thought it would, and I kind of wish that I did it way back at the start. Sweet. So now I'm jumping into Moho. And one thing that I think is really cool about Moho is every time you launch it up, it launches with one of its sort of built-in rigs and animations so that you can sort of get an idea of how things play out and play around with their rigs a little bit. But we're not going to do that. So I'm going to start a new document and then bring up the project settings. At this point, I didn't really know where anything was, but I found it and it had exactly what I was after. I wanted to make a 4K animation that would match the resolution of my filmed footage at the start of this video. And yeah, fairly intuitive. And I think that goes for a lot of Moho's interface. So now that our resolution is set up, it's time to import our character to Moho. And this is probably the part that took me the longest. I tried a bunch of different ways, and I really want to take a moment to talk about them here so that if anybody else is thinking about trying out Moho, I really think that this is something that you should keep in mind before diving in. So ultimately, the goal is to bring your character into Moho. You want to retain all of the same layer structure that you have in your vector illustration program, and make sure that everything is lined up the exact same way that you export it, right? That sounds pretty easy, but when you're working with vector characters, you're going to be exporting SVGs, and that raises a few problems. So for instance, if you export the entire project as one SVG, that's definitely doable. However, when you bring it into Moho, you're going to have every object on one layer. This means that you have to duplicate it several times and delete everything that doesn't exist on the particular layers you have selected. So for example, if you export the whole SVG and you only wanted the hand to appear on a layer, then you have to select every other vertice in that picture and then delete it and just make sure that the hand is left, and do that for every single object. Huge time-consuming process. I don't like it. Another way is to pretty much do the same thing, except export each layer individually with a transparent rectangle placed on top of it. This means when you import it into Moho, all you have to do is delete the rectangle and everything stays in place and is lined up the way that you previously saw it. The final way is to export each layer individually by itself. Now, this sounds good on paper, but if you try to do that from Affinity Designer, it's going to export those SVGs trimmed, especially if you use the export persona. I scoured the internet for ages and was surprised to find out that, yeah, basically if you try to export each piece individually, it's going to trim it to around that piece, which I hope that I'm explaining this right, but basically what that means is when you import your 40 or 50 SVGs, they're all going to import at the exact same size as one another and stack on top of each other in the center of the main window. And that means that you have to select each one and scale them down and realign them, even the eyes and mouth and everything. So that's the route that I wound up taking in the end because I was getting frustrated with the amount of time that I spent on it. And yeah, it was a little bit disappointing to find that out. Apparently, if you're designing things in Adobe Illustrator, there is a plugin out there that allows you to export SVGs at the same size, which takes out a lot of these headaches, but there is nothing like that that exists for Affinity Designer. So yeah, ultimately, I think it's probably better to just design your characters in something like Affinity Designer or Affinity Photo, just to sort of, concept them out. And then when you're ready to make the final character to be rigged, I would design that in Moho. All of that said, it's a completely different story if you're trying to animate pixel-based artwork inside of Moho. I won't be doing that in this video, but in the next one, there is quite a bit of that. So we'll just wait and see how that goes. Sweet, so now we finally entered the rigging process. And if you don't have much experience with rigging in other pieces of software, this might seem really foreign to you. I do have a fair amount of experience rigging 3D characters. So I didn't find it too far from doing that. A lot of the parenting and bone scaling systems and all that were pretty much the same. However, the way these bones behave is definitely a little different to working in 3D. So I was able to easily set up like a main control, which you see sticking out the side there, all of his arms, his spine, and everything like that. But you also put in bones for the hair, which can react to physics, and I wound up using that. Now in 3D, you use a process called weight painting to help determine how much of your 3D mesh should be influenced by one bone. That isn't exactly the case here, although you kind of do wind up doing that. It just behaves a little differently. But basically, I wound up selecting every bone and every piece of illustration or an SVG that that bone should influence and binding it to them. That way, there's no bending or warping or anything unnatural that I don't want. Each action is related to one in particular bone. I'm really sorry if I'm not explaining this well. I'm not very well versed in this program. As I said at the start, this is my first time using it. I'm definitely coming from a more motion graphics and 3D perspective when trying this out. And I haven't really rigged 2D characters before, save for some basic rigging in Adobe Animate years ago. So I'm trying my best to explain this and point out any pitfalls that I encountered my first time around, things that wasted a lot of my time and that I now have a better understanding of. So if we have a look here, you can see that when I bend the arm, the actual shape of the arm is sort of skewed and warping in sort of unnatural ways. And there is a way to fix that. You actually have a surprising amount of control over what these bones do and how they behave. We can also see down here that when I'm moving his ankle, it's actually pulling the drawing of his right foot along with it, and that's something we don't want. And this is why we're binding our bones to certain parts of our illustration so that they only influence the areas we want them to. Now, if we have a look here, we can see that when I'm bending the lower spine control, the hips are staying in place, but his shirt is kind of warping and separating from that line. Now, there's not really a whole lot of vertices here to help dictate the action, and we do go in and sort of fix that up a little bit. So here you can see me placing in a few more vertices for that shirt, and then I wind up for lack of a better word, stitching that to the bottom mesh. And that way, when everything bends, it bends kind of nicely. Now I'm doing this for the arm, and this is, I think, where Moho shines the most. You can set up actions for particular bones. So let's say, for example, his arm bones are bent in this V shape at this particular angle. I can then dictate that when the bone gets to that point, this is how I want the vertices to be arranged so that the shape behaves in the way that I want it to. Now, this is a very simple example of this sort of thing, but now no matter when I bend this arm, that shape is going to be retained. Now you can see that if I'm bending it about halfway, it doesn't work. If I bend it back the other way, it doesn't really work. And I think that winds up coming down to the sheer lack of vertices that I have to work with here. If I had have used a lot more points or a bit more detail, maybe it would work out all right. But what I wound up doing was actually creating the top arm and the forearm separately so that I could rig them slightly differently, move them independently, and have a lot more control over how they behaved. So I wound up playing around with this method a lot just to try and get it working the way I wanted to. And that's when I realized it was a lot more work than it was worth. It's probably definitely doable to continue to do it that way, but I think I was just costing myself more time. And so what I wound up doing was going back and redesigning everything. Now you can see here that I've done that to the legs. I've redesigned them as separate objects. And now the legs bend a lot nicer. We're using actions just to make sure that everything stays aligned when legs are bent to certain angles. And now whenever I bend a leg a certain way, nothing is breaking. And so here you can see me redesigning the arms. So I designed these arms in Moho. I couldn't be bothered exporting any more SVGs that day. So yeah, here you can see me sort of matching it up to the base illustration, and then I just delete the old arm and rebind the new arm. And with this method, now the arms were behaving the exact way that I wanted them to. And I was able to set up a couple of actions that just tweaked it a little bit so that nothing would break. Now you can sort of see me fumbling my way around this a little bit. In the end, I did get it working, but it was a lot of trial and error. I didn't really understand all of the tools and shortcuts yet. And yeah, in case you're wondering, it's not like I figured all of this out on my own. A lot of it I did find very intuitive, but when I got stuck I read the tutorial guide that comes with Moho, and if there was nothing in there that was helping me to answer my questions, a quick YouTube search brought up a lot of different examples. Now, a lot of them didn't exactly apply to the artwork I was working on, but a lot of the same principles did. So I wound up sort of getting my head around it in the end. Now, I also tried my best to redesign the hands so that they weren't all one shape, because I was hoping to sort of move the fingers around a little bit. Now, towards the end, all I did with this guy was make a walk cycle animation. And I sort of tried to rig the fingers up in a way that I could swing them back and forth and have some overlapping action. But ultimately, in the end, I barely used it. You do see his hand come up and wave at one point, but if you look closely, the fingers are actually all skewed and bent and warped in a really weird and unnatural way. So yeah, I didn't really put a whole lot of effort into this. I wish that I did. But ultimately, I was pretty done with it at this point. I think I had my head around what I wanted to learn, and I just moved on to the next thing. So here you can see that I've finally redesigned those arms and legs in a way that I wanted to. A quick tip here, by the way, if you wind up redesigning your arms and legs or whatever it is in Affinity Designer and then bring it over to Moho, let's say, for example, you've got a forearm. If you want to duplicate that for the opposite side of the body and flip it using the flip tool or like flip horizontal tool in Affinity Designer, for some reason, when you bring it into Moho, it completely breaks the shape and it winds up looking like a really weird blob. I don't understand why this is. I'm assuming that Affinity Designer applies some sort of modifier to the shape that doesn't carry across properly when it comes into other software. I didn't know that that would be saved into an SVG. I was really curious about it, but I couldn't see a lot of people talking about it on the internet. So I guess it is what it is. Basically, just import, what you can to Moho and then flip it in Moho. That wound up working for me. Now here you can see me setting up these extra bones on the foot controls. Now these kind of act as point bones. I think I'm saying that right. I do forget the proper terminology for this setup of rig. But basically, this is one of the reasons why I decided to get Moho Pro instead of Moho Debut. I feel like this is a really important feature it's kind of a shame that it's missing from the lower tier version of Moho. But basically what it does is it gives you the ability to lock bones in place while you control the rest of your rig by another bone. So for example, I have them applied to his ankles in his shoes. And that basically means that I can control his leg movements with those bones. But if I decide to take his global control or his hip control and shift it up and down, those bones are going to stay in place, which means that whenever he squats, for example, his feet will actually stay flat on the ground and the rest of his body will drop as if he is doing a squat. This is so vital for when you're doing walk cycles so that everything stays on the ground basically and you don't have any floating bones. I'm really surprised to see something like this omitted from the debut version, or at least that's what I read on the internet, that the debut version doesn't have this. So yeah, bit of a shame. Definitely worth getting the pro version if you're expecting to do sort of animations like this. Now you can see me using actions to fix up the shoes. So every time I bent his toes, for example, the sole of his shoe would come off, and we can just fix those with actions. I'm really loving this whole actions feature. It's an absolute lifesaver. I really think it's awesome. One thing I haven't really played around with yet, and I'll probably like make a whole dummy project to give this a go in my own time. But I really couldn't see a easy way to copy. For example, I have this foot rig all bound to one shoe and I've created all of the actions for it. Now I had to go ahead and do that for the other foot as well. And considering the fact that they're pretty much the same object, I really wish that there was a way to just copy that part of the bone structure and all of the actions and the vector shapes associated with it and duplicate it so that I didn't have to re-rig everything all over again. Now, there might be a way to do that yet, but For now, I haven't found it, and I haven't really looked that much into it either. I kind of just took the long way. But yeah, if anybody knows how to go about doing that, please let me know in the comments. I'd greatly appreciate it. So yeah, at this point, everything was looking pretty good. His whole body moved and behaved in the way I wanted. I went ahead and changed the color of the back arm and back leg to a slightly darker color, and his arm to a slightly lighter color, just so that you could see it against other parts of his body. And when I put him into the basic key pose for the first step of a walk cycle, everything seemed to behave pretty much the way I wanted it to. So now it was time to move on to the head rig. So basically what you can do is set up control bones to control certain parts of your mesh to do specific actions. So for example, here you can see that I have a left-right control for the pupils and an up-down control for them as well. You basically create an action that says if the bone is this way, the eyes go that way too, and if the bone is facing the other way, then they go in the opposite direction. You keyframe all of this in its own separate timeline, and then when you come back, you're able to move that control bone back and forth, and everything will behave the way that you have set it up. The beauty of this is that you can set up multiple control bones to control the same things. So I have the left-right movement for the pupils and the up-down movement. And when I use those two bones at the same time, the eyes behave in the exact way that I want them to. I can make them go left and up or right and down, whatever I want, and there doesn't seem to be anything breaking when I do it. Now, I did discover a few issues with certain control bones and getting them to behave the way that I wanted them to, but ultimately the way around it for me was just to redesign how things were drawn. So, for example, might be a little hard to explain, and I don't think I managed to record it properly. When I turn his head to look front onto the camera, there is only one side of his glasses that I actually drew, and the other one didn't exist. So basically, I had to split off the front of the glasses and the arms of the glasses so that if I turn them left and right, you would eventually see both arms of the glasses, and then one arm would disappear when you look the other way. I know, super confusing. I really wish that I filmed this better and maybe recorded while I was doing it. But basically what I'm trying to say is if certain bones aren't working right when you're getting them to do specific actions, sometimes a quick redesign of parts of your illustration might be what's missing. This is really cool. Man, like I can't tell you how long I've waited to be able to use Moho. I've been eyeing it off for so long, as I said, and like the ability to rig a character in the same way that you would a 3D character is it's just mind-blowing to me. I absolutely love this workflow. You know, if you're somebody like me, you're a one-man show and you don't exactly have, you know, an entire week to sit down and smash out drawing after drawing after drawing to take a frame by frame method, this is definitely the way to go. Such a time saver to be able to set up reusable rigs with reusable expressions and reusable animations and just animate until your heart's content, you know, just to save as much time as possible while still making it look relatively good. I found this entire process to be really simple to pick up. It definitely did have its challenges, but it did not wind up being as challenging as I thought it would be. Now, I definitely skipped the part of me making him walk. I'm sorry. I always have at least several points when I'm recording these things where I forget to hit the screen record button. But basically, what I wound up doing is creating a very simple walk cycle. You know, he's taking one step every half second, or 2 full steps every second. And then I found that you can actually save an entire animation into the actions panel, which means whenever you want to recall a cycled action, you just have to drag it and drop it into your main timeline, and there it is playing out. And after that, you are free to go in and make tweaks and changes to certain bones as that action is happening. What does this mean? It means basically I've created a walk cycle that I can drag and drop anywhere, and I can make his arm come up and wave at us. I can also turn his head around and look in different directions, and the rest of the walk cycle is completely untouched, and I don't have to keep on animating. This is an amazing time saver, and it was super intuitive to use and set up. I really, at the moment, I'm totally in love with this software and the way it behaves. It's definitely got a few things I don't like, but I wound up liking it a lot more than I anticipated. And with all of that said, yeah, I think that pretty much brings us to a close here. So that is it for me today, everybody. I hope that you got some sort of enjoyment out of this. I'm going to wrap this up really quick because my camera's dying. Please stay tuned for my next episode. I wound up using Moho and After Effects and Affinity Designer to help a client's dream project sort of come to life in a really cool and unique way. I can't wait to share that with you next. And yeah, sorry this content was a little bit more meandery than some of my other stuff, but I'm hoping that the next one won't be. So yeah, until then, thanks for tuning in. Cheers.